Thank you for downloading this podcast from the British Theatre Guide. For more information about British Theatre Guide, please visit britishtheatreguide.info. As the 2019 Edinburgh Festival Fringe was about to start, we spoke to two people whose work will be featured in this year's festival. Later, you can hear our conversation with Daniel Bye, whose latest show features, and in fact is named after, his 4.5-month-old son, Arthur, and will come to you rather than you having to go to it. But first, we spoke to Jessie Jones, co-director of the latest devised theatre piece from Bristol-based company The Wardrobe Ensemble, produced in collaboration with Complicite and Royal and Derngate Theatre in Northampton, called The Last of the Pelican Daughters. The day after the first preview in Edinburgh, I asked Jessie how this production originated.
I suppose the show started off with us thinking about the stories that we're interested in telling. I suppose as a company, we often are looking for shows that in some way explore the present moment and our generation and where we see our place in the world at any particular one time. And we often kind of look back in order to look forward. Our shows are often set in a particular time period. But one of the things that we thought would be interesting to explore when Complicite first, because it's co-production with Complicite, and when they first got in contact with us, we were sort of interested in exploring what it would look like for the Wardrobe Ensemble to do a family drama, to look at those old big plays, you know, Chekhov, Ibsen, Shakespeare to a certain extent, and the list goes on, and for us to look at those plays that are the big family drama. And when these plays work best, they explore sort of the intricacies of a particular family, but that family in some way sheds light on the particular moment that they are in, I suppose, like a change in society, sort of the changing of the guard of the bourgeoisie and lots of sort of Chekhovian plays, I suppose, and using the family as a metaphor for society more widely, for generational rifts and grievances, I suppose, and that kind of what you do when you're left the family estate or society as a generation. What decisions do you make as you move into the future? When do your ideologies bend through pragmatism and sort of having to deal with real-world issues, inheritance, who's going to look after the aging grandmother, what you're going to do with the house when people actually have children. Yeah. And we just were very interested in those kind of things, and that's where the show kind of came from. And then we've gone through a sort of R&D process over a period of years, and kind of come to the show that we find ourselves now.
As a story, it's something that a lot of people will find familiar from, like you say, from drama, but also from real life.
From real life, exactly. And that's I think we went into it at first on quite an academic level of going like, okay, well, what are the things that happen in these stories, da-da-da-da-da. But as we kind of lent into it, we realised actually the similarities between that genre and soap opera and The Simpsons, and sort of actually looking at families there's so much sort of resonance with your everyday person. There's something about when we talk about the big family drama sort of plays that can feel, you know, like I suppose elitist in some senses, but actually at their heart, what they're dealing with is family dynamics. And then when they work at their best, they explore something bigger in society. But actually what we found is really digging into the stories and the intricacies of those family, or of the family, and their turmoil at the loss of their mother, and trying to work out with what they do with this house, and in some senses the burden of the inheritance. More than any of our shows, feels like when I'm sitting and watching it, the things that are landing with an audience just carry on coming. You can kind of see the nods of recognition around the audience time and time again in different moments with different circumstances that are happening. And that feels quite universal, I suppose, in the way that audiences are reacting to it so far. Obviously, they're very early in, but and I suppose for us, there's something about it that our theatre company is quite like a big family, really. I mean, we've been together as a theatre company for 8 years. Some of us, we were all in youth theatre together before that. Some people have been making work together for sort of 15, for over half of our lives. Yeah. We are our closest friends, and we consistently work together for 6 to 8 months of the year, have made 15 shows together as a company. and are gaining more and more sort of credit and success, I suppose. But with that comes more pressure and an expectation to grow up slightly as a theatre company. I've just had a kid. You know, we came together when I'm the oldest in the company, and I was 23, and the youngest in the company was 17. And now I'm, you know, in my 30s, and they're in their late 20s. And there feels like there's a coming of age into adulthood, whereas I think quite a lot of our work before was sort of late adolescence coming into early adulthood, and this feels like we're moving our tone and shifting the work slightly. I mean, it still feels like a wardrobe ensemble show. It's still silly. It still has this irreverent humour. It's slightly less physical than our other work, although people are coming out and still saying, "Oh, like, you know, it's very physical, but feels less physical to us."
Yeah.
And there's something about that subject matter in those big plays and the issues that we're dealing with death and societal change and change within families that just feels like fruitful ground for us, and something that we're excited about exploring. And it feels like an audience are excited about exploring that with us in the way that we tell stories, and that's quite exciting.
So you're actually dealing with more adult themes, do you think, more as you're growing up, you're dealing with issues that you're coming across maybe in your own life?
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, I think we've always dealt with themes that resonate to an adult audience. But yeah, I mean, if you think that after the first show that we brought up to if we just look at our Fringe shows, sort of out of our sort of canon of work, I suppose, then our first show was about a riot that happened in IKEA, and was this sort of satire about the ridiculous of that situation. And the principal characters in it were young people that were working in an IKEA store, and those young people were, the lead characters were kind of, didn't really know what they were doing, sort of had been thrust into working in this store, and then there was a riot. And in some sense, that's where we were making the show. Do you know what I mean? We were young people going, okay, yeah, cool, let's make this thing. And we were very, very lucky that there was fortunate circumstances prevailed that after we brought it up to this, it was in 2011, we brought it up to the Fringe. A few days later, the London riots happened, and this kind of like comedic satire about the ridiculousness of a riot in IKEA suddenly became hot property, biting the zeitgeist political theatre.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that was about young people coming out of A-levels, I suppose. It wasn't about them, but those were the lead characters in it. 1972, The Future of Sex, is about a group of young people, young women, that don't know each other, but that are having some kind of sexual awakening in the 70s at any one particular time. And I suppose within our journey, going from that kind of tentative coming out of A-levels in riot to this sort of like more maybe theatrical awakening in 1972, The Future of Sex, and then in education, where it's in a school, and that's kind of a learnt schooled environment. And the teachers, I suppose, are the teachers are the lead characters in that, but it was still in the teaching and education environment. And then this is the big sort of family drama, and everybody's slightly older, and they're talking about big issues in their lives, I suppose. And that's just kind of feels like a bit of a journey. Who knows what we'll make next? I imagine if we're still together when we're in our 70s, we'll probably make a show about nursing homes.
Yes.
You know what I mean? It's sort of like, because the way that we make work is that we write, there are lots of devised theatre companies out there, but we not only devise the work, in some senses, we are heavily focused on it's a new writing, devising company in some senses, in that we don't really make adaptations. We do some adaptations in our family work. I suppose our theatre idols are Complicite, in who we're working with at the moment, and Knee High.
Yeah.
And what those two companies do is that they take a pre-existing narrative and they adapt that story. Do you know what I mean? For the stage.
Yeah.
And that's not what we do. We make brand new pieces of work in a devised way that stand alone as what one might describe as new writing in a slightly different sense, if that makes any sense.
I suppose the devising process, the nature of the devising process, means because the performers are actually creating the dialogue and the characters themselves, it makes it more personal, does it, do you think, to them? Indeed. I mean, I think all of us in the company and people that make the shows, so the company is, 9 consistent members, growing, a lot of associate artists, but in those 9 core members,
We create the show together. There is no artistic director. We usually have co-directors. We make every decision how the company is run together in a Skype meeting every Monday. I have done that for 8 years. And so there is a bit of all of us in all of the shows.
Yeah, yeah.
We can look through all of the shows that we've done and go, oh, yeah, that's a bit of my life, that's a bit of their life, that's a bit of their life. You know, it's snippets of all of these things. And I think one of the reasons why our work reaches quite a broad audience and why lots of people engage with it is that the fact is that if you have 9 people's lived experience in a show, then that is going to touch quite a wide base of audience in some senses. Yeah. Because if it's happened to someone in the 9, then it's probably happened to one in 9 people generally across the board, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. It was interesting to read the opening of the description of this particular production, which I should say is the last of the Pelican Daughters.
Yeah.
There are 2 sentences in that which seem contradictory, and which is it's good PR in a sense, so it intrigues. But it said, in folklore, pelican mothers feed their young on their own blood. In 2019, 4 sisters are trying to divide their mother's house between them. I don't mean contradictory. I mean, they seem to be 2 things that aren't related. Now, that's often the way devised work starts, isn't it? You find things that don't seem to be related and find the connections between them. Is that your process? Is this where this particular show began?
In terms of that,
those contradictions, or those apparently unrelated themes that you brought together.
No. Actually, that's not where the show started with us. As I said, thinking about the big family drama, thinking about inheritance, thinking about us inheriting society, thinking about our parents, the fact that our parents unfortunately will pass away soon, and some people's parents have.
Yeah.
And actually, what we found is that when people argue about money after death, when people are trying to deal with the estates of their families, that can become quite callous and cold very quickly.
Yeah.
And actually, the Pelican Daughters thing comes from King Lear calls his daughters Pelican Daughters.
Right.
And it is a turn of phrase, although not a commonly used one. You might say that you have children that are Pelican Daughters if they are trying to bleed you dry.
Right.
I might say.
Yeah.
And somebody said that, and at that time, the protagonists in the show were 4 sisters, and they were kind of arguing about the money and what to do with it, and that kind of came out as an apt, happy coincidence, actually, which actually I would say I think that actually, and in some ways maybe this is what you're alluding to, is that actually a lot of devising is about setting up a framework, setting up some rules, investigating a theme or a style, and then most of the time the things that get into the play, or the part that you follow and get really excited about, are the happy accidents that happen in a very controlled environment. So sometimes you can say sort of, oh, we follow happy accidents, and it makes it seem all very...
a bit random.
A bit random. But the reality is that there's, very considered strict rules and ways of working that mean that you stumble across some happy accidents. But it's about making the space for those things to come about, and then to be maneuverable enough to be able to move into those spaces when they occur, if that makes some kind of sense, and go, actually, that's interesting, let's follow that. That's where we should be going. And that's the beauty of devised work in some sense, is that you can turn the ship a lot quicker than one can when working in a more conventional way with one playwright, if you like.
Can you explain a bit more about the characters? Because you seem to have a diverse set of characters with different wants from the estate.
So the kind of the sisters come from this thing of, on one level, make up of the company, but on a second level, I suppose, we kind of built the character of this mother, and these young women, her daughters. The mother is of the baby boomer generation, is very left-leaning, is a kind of staunch feminist, brought her children up without any men in their lives, without any fathers in their lives, in a very particular kind of way that is like some of the way that some of the company's parents decided to bring them up. and is something that feels very familiar, I suppose. They were brought up with a particular ideology, and then when their mother dies and money is left on the table, what we see, but once those young women have flown the nest and life has started to lead them in different ways, what they've decided to pursue, how they felt about the ideologies that their mother had brought them up into, what now in their late 20s and early 30s they are being pulled at in terms of where their priorities lie and how they feel about the ideologies that they were brought up with. And then when their mother dies and they go and leaves in her will the line, my estate will be split fairly between my daughters, and one of the daughters picks up on the idea of fairly rather than equally.
Yeah.
And then you open up a can of worms of going like, what does that mean? What is it to split an inheritance fairly, to redistribute wealth more widely within society fairly? Is fairness and equality the same thing? Or do some people have a greater need and therefore should receive greater help or inheritance? Are interesting big questions about how we divide one's inheritance, but also how we decide to move forward in society more widely. And the characters where they kind of sit are kind of, I suppose, as often as in our plays, what we're trying to do is give people the ability to be able to defend a position within our work as characters coming from a particular backstory or place.
Right.
That allows them to do so. Does that make some kind of sense? There's quite a meandering way of sort of saying they are engineered to be able to have a particular viewpoint. Because if they have that viewpoint and then we put them into the situations of our play, then they can passionately or not so passionately or articulately or less articulately argue that point and kind of give a reflection of the spectrum of people within society, our audience. Does that kind of make sense? I don't know.
Yeah. So you're telling the social political point through the personal.
Exactly that. And that's what we're always trying to do. And sometimes people completely do not get that in our work.
No.
And our work sits and should sit as a form of entertainment, and very much what you see is what you get. But every single character and every single decision has been talked about and thought about in great detail and are there to serve a purpose on a wider scale than necessarily just to hit drama. They are not dramatic devices. Yes, they fulfill drama and fulfill plot within the story, but, we will often ascribe big societal ideas or who that person represents within society to those characters within our process. Sometimes we don't deliver in highlighting that enough to an audience, and sometimes we highlight it too much to an audience. But always, that's kind of what we're thinking. How can they be, in some senses, I don't know, like a microcosm of, how can our given circumstance on stage be a microcosm for wider society?
Yeah, and wider issues.
And wider issues, and we're very much interested in that. Yeah. So that's kind of how they are there, and by their nature are often some kind of extension of the performer that you see playing, because those parts are created by that performer, and there is some line to be drawn for the most part between the performer and the character in some way.
Yeah. The process of devising, though, it's compared to just getting a script and doing 5 weeks rehearsal, it's a very long and involved process. And as director or co-director, you've got to somehow bring it together, because some devised work I've seen, it's a lot of bits of things that don't really add up to a whole, and that's always a danger, isn't it? So how do you as director bring all that together?
So I think the first part of the book, like often our shows start with one of the directors having, or someone in the company, just anyone in the company really, having a theme or a moment in history that they want to explore, and we start to do a bit of R&D on it. And essentially, once that bit of R&D is offered up to the company, And that idea will never be the same again.
Yeah.
It will never be the...
So the starting point doesn't really matter anymore.
Exactly. It gets and it gets removed from the person.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? It's like actually it becomes company property. Yeah. And then the idea evolves over a long period of time. And in the beginning phase, the kind of director role within the company is really a facilitating one. Yeah. It's about facilitating the exploration of an idea until, as a company, we find the nugget, the core theme, the key narrative points, the key plot points, what we want to say. And then those things start to crystallize. And then the director's job is to kind of start to lead those bits of, just to start to focus in a little bit and to hone in and go, okay, well, this, as you know, these things are starting to make sense, that's starting to make less sense. We're outside of it. We can see that actually how we need to shape the journey in order for us to get from A to B. And then it goes into a phase of, you know, just starting to rehearse and refine like any other production. Yeah. And just bring the whole thing together. But it is, particularly within our context, it's, as I said, we've made so much work together. There is no artistic director of the company. We work together in an incredibly collaborative way, is that it is a different beast. You know, I work quite a lot away from the company in a freelancing director capacity on shows, most of them not devised, but it is a different beast, making work with this company and making devised work in a truly collaborative way. Because again, most of the time, people kind of go, oh, well, it's a devising process, so therefore that's an incredibly collaborative, egalitarian kind of way of working. But actually what you find for the most part is that with most companies, that's not the case. Most companies, it's often very much director or writer-led, and that it isn't a kind of particularly, it is very collaborative, all work in theatre, making theatre at all across anything is a very collaborative process. But the kind of ownership over the work is not the same, whereas ours, we all own the show. It is written by all of us. So then the director's role is, and one of the reasons why we co-direct, I think, on a lot of our shows, is to keep a check on that voice in the room. Right. Because actually, if co-directors, even when you get into that refining moment, they're needing to have a shared vision of what it is, it means that one person can't run away with their idea of what it is in the same way. Does that make some kind of sense?
Makes perfect sense.
You always have to have check-ins, do you know what I mean? Yeah. What you're best serving for the company and for what we want to do as a collective. And it's a really difficult thing to do, but we are very lucky that it's worked, and our process continues to change. Every show is slightly different, and our process evolves, and how we make work evolves, and the roles within the room evolve as we grow older as a company and as we make more and more work together. But yeah, in some sense, that's a very long way round of saying, at first, you're more of a facilitator within the room, and then by the time you're in tech and in previews, that role has become more conventional in its approach, because the play needs to go on. Yeah. And it needs to be well rehearsed, and there needs to be a link between the production and the play. Yeah.
You mentioned before that this one is developed in partnership with Complicite. Your company, you produce a lot of work and you've got quite a reputation, but Complicite are a company in a different league entirely, aren't they? So how did that come about, and how has it worked? How have you actually partnered with them?
So they saw an early work in progress of a show that we did, 1972, The Future of Sex. And then the year that we opened that in Edinburgh, they opening the Encounter, the international festival, and they'd been watching us as a company. We opened that show, and lots of people's response to 1972, The Future of Sex was that it felt like a early Complicite show. And actually people had kind of been comparing us in some ways to that work of Complicite's early work. They enjoyed the show, opened up conversations, and kind of they'd opened this new program of associates of them developing work, who the first person that they partnered with in that capacity was Bridie Kimmings. And then they kind of talked to us, and Hannah, our amazing producer, sort of had long chat with them, and we met them a number of times and Tom, who's a co-director, we talked to them a lot. And we just started to develop this relationship where they were kind of going like, yeah, like how can we help? What can we do to help you take a step up, I suppose, in your ambition and your work and find a new audience? And I think as they've said, and other people have said, that they felt like we are the children of Complicity and knee-high, really. And they kind of are in a position where they want to be able to facilitate in a climate where I think they are very aware of their privilege in terms of the funding situation at the time that they came through that allowed them to grow and make the art that they wanted to make, and that is less easy.
Yes.
And they highlighted us as a group of theatre makers that they were inspired by and had been inspired by them. And they have collaborated, and we have collaborated over the last couple of years for us to take time to be able to have a long devising process, which is something that they really believe in, to give us the time and space to be able to explore and investigate how we best tell our story. And that's kind of been the role, really, as a kind of facilitator and as a champion, and quite a lot of cold hard cash to allow us, to continue to grow as a company. And it's been invaluable and an amazing partnership that actually feels really obvious and organic to us. Actually, I think both as companies at the moment, it's like it feels like it makes sense. Yeah. And for us, the fact that people were drawing those links between us and them has always been incredibly flattering. It's sort of, I remember reading it in a review years ago, and we were like, oh my God, they said we like Complicity. And actually now for us to be working in very close partnership with them, that's amazing. It's a stamp of approval that is very, very useful. Yeah. And their years of experience and expertise is very, very useful to us and our journey and how we continue to grow, really.
Yeah. Well, as I'm speaking to you now, it's the 1st of August. The Fringe officially opens tomorrow, but you actually opened last night, didn't you? So how's it gone?
We did our first preview yesterday. Yeah, it's been good. It's good. It's hard as the work you make gets bigger. Coming and getting a show in at the Fringe becomes more difficult because they are not. Most of the spaces are not theatres.
Yeah.
And there are so many shows, and there's all the restrictions that come with that. And we did 2 previews at the Royal and Derngate, and the show will go out and tour at mid-scale. So we did 2 previews at the Royal and Derngate on that scale with all of the tech time that kind of comes with that. And then we brought it into the theatre, and the teams at Pleasance are amazing, and they support us brilliantly through our shows, and Pleasance and Zoo before them, when we used to go to Zoo venues.
Yeah.
And we really believe a lot of our audience is in Edinburgh, and we think our shows really find their feet in Edinburgh, and we're really committed to the Fringe as a process, and we think it's good for our work, and we know that it's really good for companies. But as the shows get bigger, and as they become more complex and more nuanced, it becomes harder to put them into venues. You can feel the venues creaking.
Yes.
They're not designed to have 350 people sitting on a rake with, 250 lighting cues and projectors and sound and all of these things being chucked at them.
Yeah.
They find that it's a really difficult and hard thing to do. So it's quite stressful, and it's just, quite intense for everybody, but then an audience sit down and hopefully they enjoy it, and hopefully it's all worth it. And I think it really does help the work and give it a place to fly from. But there are compromises that you make when putting a show into a venue that isn't made for theatre. The fact that it's going to be really hot and they need to put fans on, but those fans kind of trample over the sound design that is really nuanced of a show. Do you see what I mean? Like there are these compromises that you're tussling with, and to be honest, there's no right or wrong answer with all of those things. And you do also have to remember that the spirit of the Fringe is real and is a thing. But then, like I said, it's the best place to talk about your work. People come out, they're engaged with the theatre making process, and our work often changes after it leaves the Fringe, and a lot of that comes from the conversations that we have in bars and in coffee shops and on the streets of Edinburgh with our audience. and talking to them about what lands, what doesn't land, and our work evolves through that. And you don't really get that opportunity to grow work with an audience, a very engaged theatre audience and a theatre literate audience. You don't get that. It's very rare that you get that opportunity elsewhere, and the Fringe is amazing for that.
That was Jessie Jones from the Wardrobe Ensemble. The last of the Pelican Daughters is at Pleasance Beyond until the 25th of August 2019. For more information, see www.thewardrobeensemble.com. Daniel Bye's previous solo shows at the Fringe and elsewhere have always been quite interactive, but for his latest piece he will be getting even closer to his audience than before, and he has a co-star in a non-speaking role after whom the show is named. Here's Daniel to explain.
So the show is about genetics and class and inheritance and all that sort of thing. And it's, I guess, about the world that we're creating for our children. But what's unusual about it is that I do the show live with my baby son, Arthur, who's 4.5 months old. And the show is performed in the flat of whoever books it. So it's kind of about the meeting point between genetics and the domestic environment. And Arthur kind of represents genetics, and your hall represents the domestic environment. And that's it in quite a big nutshell.
Right. And you said about you perform this in people's houses, flats or whatever. So how does that actually work?
It's quite straightforward in some ways. Once you've got over the initial kind of confusion of it, or the surprise of it, it works in quite a simple way. You book the show in the ordinary way through the Fringe office. So rather than booking a ticket for the show, you book the whole show for you and 9 or 10 of your friends. And then once you book your ticket, the Fringe office tells you to give me your address so that I know where to come and do the show. And then at the allotted time, I rock up with Arthur in the sling and talk to you for a bit. So it's fairly straightforward, really.
Yeah. But in Edinburgh, most people who are in Edinburgh are not staying in the place where they normally live, are they? So, but a lot of them are in some kind of a house or a flat, I suppose, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, it's a mix as well. So I think maybe a third to half of the bookings will come from people who are just up in Edinburgh for the festival, perhaps with a show of their own, or perhaps they work for a venue, or they're part of the wider industry, or they just come up for a few days. But also, I've always been surprised when I've done shows in Edinburgh in the past by how many of my audience are actually people from Edinburgh. Yeah. And there's this sort of myth, which has some basis, in fact, that people from Edinburgh don't have anything to do with the festival and hate the very idea or a mention of its existence. And there are some people who stick to that stereotype, but there are also plenty of people who really want to see a few things and get involved and also see some things that are a little bit outside of what they might usually see at the big theatres in Edinburgh. The Fringe is an opportunity to catch something that's really unusual and surprising. And so I kind of hope I fit that bill a little bit. So quite a few of my bookings will be from people who are bona fide Edinburgh residents, and I hope that they are. You know, I think it's a beautiful city, and it's good to be here for the month. And so the more people who are from here, the better.
Yeah. So your star of the show, who's going to feature Arthur, he was very young when you first got this idea. This is an artist sort of thinking, what am I going to do, looking around and saying, I've got a child, so that's got to be part of the show. Is that what it was?
Sort of. I mean, I'd love to say that he came along and there was a flash of inspiration the first instant our eyes met. It was actually an idea that first came up when his big sister was born. She's nearly 3 now, and she's up here. We've come up to the festival as a whole family, and she's up here as well. So it's an idea that we originally had, me and Sarah, who's the director of the show, and also my wife and Arthur's mother. Yeah. But just for various, mostly quite practical reasons, it wasn't possible to get it off the ground first time round 2 or 3 years ago. And then earlier this year, we're just kind of looking at the summer ahead and thinking, I've got a bit of space in my diary here. I could make an Edinburgh show. and I was talking about one thing, and Sarah said, what about this show we were going to make a few years ago about inheritance and genetics? And it just fit perfectly. So we must have had that conversation when Arthur was about 3 or 4 weeks old. And we'd obviously done that initial work on the idea a couple of years ago, and it had just been brewing since then. And so it was kind of ready to cook, as it were.
So you didn't decide to have another child just to do the show then?
Now, that would be a good story. Yeah, re-edit it quick, put that in.
But it's a serious show. You've got some serious subjects in there. So obviously it's going to be you rather than Arthur who's going to be talking about them. So what is the content of the show? What are you talking about?
Yeah, I mean, Arthur may do more or less as the mood takes him.
Yeah.
His job is to be there to be a baby and to have the needs of a baby. Yeah. And my job is to meet those needs while trying to fit the material of the show in around the edges. But the content of the show, I've done quite a few performance lecture style shows over the last few years, kind of exploring scientific or socio-political concept and kind of just unpacking that idea and telling some stories and playing some games that open out that idea for the audience. This one started as an exploration into the emerging science of epigenetics, which is, I suppose, a new way of looking at the meeting point between nature and nurture, between genetics and environment. And it's a relatively young science. So when this show first was floated, as I said, a couple of years ago, Sarah introduced me to the notion of epigenetics. I'd actually never even heard of this science at that point, and got really interested in it, explored it, and then so when we came back to the idea this year, when it was possible to get the show moving, it was just a case of getting further into it. But as always happens with any show, you start with a really clear area of inquiry, and it grows and it grows, and it ends up being about loads of things that you didn't know it was going to be about. It ended up being a performance lecture, and it's mostly me opening up to some scientific ideas. But it's nevertheless somehow ended up being the most personal piece of theatre that I've ever made, the most emotionally closing in some ways, as I in some ways confront my powerlessness as a parent. There are small things that you can do that have an influence on how your child develops. Yeah. But ultimately, so much of it is down to the world outside of your four walls. And that's liberating, but it is also frightening in some ways. And it's a confrontation with some of the kind of difficult truths about the world we're creating for our children as well. And looking that square in the face while sitting with a sort of 5-month-old baby on top is quite emotionally exposing in some ways. So although it's kind of playful, fun, opening up of some scientific ideas at root, and that's what it is for quite a lot of it, it also gets into something a bit deeper than that and a bit more raw and real and emotional.
Right.
But mostly it's fun.
Yeah. My understanding is that genetics is something that's fixed when you're born. It doesn't change, whereas epigenetics is how your genetic programming is expressed, and that can change throughout your life. Is that correct? So that's the nurture side of it. That's more or less exactly right. So there's always been this kind of confusion about your gene code never changes, but even identical twins develop differently in different environments, and sometimes even develop differently in very similar environments. Identical twins are usually raised together, and they're always a little different in some ways. So yes, your genetic code never changes, but it expresses differently under different environmental conditions. And epigenetics specifically is the science that explains how that difference in expression takes place. So it describes how your genetics respond to environmental stimuli, which is all down to proteins attaching to your genes and coating around them and affecting the strength with which they are or are not expressed. Yeah.
And so we get into that a little bit, but that's really a way of opening up a set of ideas about who we are and how we become who we are.
Yeah. And how much control we have over who we are, is it?
Yeah, that's a big part of it.
Yeah. A lot of your shows have a strong political content, but you say this is more personal. Is there a political dimension to it as well?
Yeah, there definitely is. And again, I didn't necessarily know that there was going to be when I started making it. I thought that there was, like the environmental side of it, I thought might perhaps end up being about class in one way or another. And there's quite a large degree to which that's turned out to be the case. But it is also about, if you think of genetics interrelating to the environment for us as humans is the social environment. The environment is other people. And we are continually making a set of choices about the world that we're all making to live in together. And right now, for me, the choices that we're making collectively as a society are pretty shabby, to be honest. They're not great. And as an individual parent or an individual human, it feels like there's relatively little that you can do to change that, to affect that. But collectively, we can change that. And so that sense of powerlessness can be flipped into a sense of collective power. And that's where the political element of this makes itself felt. So it's partly, there is a certain amount about class and to some degree my own background, but also where it really engages with a social and political subject is just a little interrogation into the choices that we're making collectively about the worlds that we're creating for our children.
This type of performance where you're going into somebody's house, you've got a small audience, you're all presumably lit the same, you won't be taking a lighting rig in or anything, or a microphone. It completely changes the power dynamic between the performer and the audience, doesn't it? You can't just stand up there and give it out the same, I suppose. It's more two-way, is it?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly true, and for me that's a real positive. In the theatre that I make for theatre-type spaces, I'm always trying to break down that power dynamic as best I can. I'm always trying to involve the audience and encourage interaction. I'm always keen for the audience to be aware that I can see them, which could sound a bit sinister in some ways, but, so that we get this sense that I am interested in hearing other voices in the space. I'm not... obviously, I've prepared and I'm going to do most of the talking, and that's what people have paid for. Yeah. But I want to encourage other voices to be present in the space, and the work that I make always involves the audience and conversation or interaction with the audience to some degree.
And you've got to find ways of breaking down barriers for that, because people don't expect that, or people are frightened of answering back sometimes in that sort of environment, aren't they?
Yeah, that's really true. And I think it's particularly true when you're doing it in a theatrical context. And in a theatre space, that's kind of fine. There are some people who are really happy to get involved, and they can. And there are some people for whom it is the very idea of hell. Yes. And they can sort of shrink back into their seats. And I'm not going to force anyone to get involved. I'm not interested in humiliating people. It's no one's job but mine. It sounds like stupid. I'm not trying to kind of force that on anyone. But the lovely thing about this domestic living room setting is it would actually be weird not to talk to the audience as though they were really there. Yeah. It would be really peculiar for us all to be in shared light in one room, sitting around with cups of tea or glasses of water or whatever, as we're at someone's house having a cup of tea, and then to pretend that's not happening and to pretend that we're somewhere else. So it's really a way of taking us a bit further the kind of choices that I normally make. And it's one of the things that's been really interesting about it, actually, is that because that's so baked into the way that we are in people's houses, it doesn't feel like a power dynamic's being broken down in the way that it does in a theatre space. Yeah. When I do that in a theatre space, it's unusual and there's a bit of challenge there. Whereas doing that in a living room, it would be just rude not to do that.
Yeah, yeah. And I suppose whatever you do, you're bound to be upstaged by your co-star anyway, aren't you?
Exactly, yeah. And that's baked into the concept, really. And there's no way in which I can have rehearsed with him in a meaningful sense. Obviously, he's been there in rehearsals, but I can't kind of write into the script. And this is the bit where Arthur hugely, and this is the bit where he cries, but because I'm such a great dad, I managed to settle him miraculously. There'll be some shows where he will just epically lose his shit, and I'd say that on the podcast.
Yes.
I haven't said it now. And there'll be some shows where he just won't be settled, and I'll have to give everyone their money back. I hope that doesn't happen, but the likelihood is that will happen once or twice because he's a baby. And, however sensitive I am to his needs and however responsive I am to him, there is an element of, I don't want to sort of over-egg this, so I'm not bracing rocks, but there's an element of risk there that it could just all fall flat on its face and be a bit embarrassing for everyone. And I'm excited to see how that rolls out. As I said to someone else quite recently, I'm a fairly experienced performer and a moderately experienced dad. I've never done them both at the same time before. Yeah. And actually, they're very similar skills. Someone else said to me quite recently that parenting is just improvisation, just responding to whatever's put in front of you and trying to add something to it. It's problem solving.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of truth in that. But doing them both at the same time is a little bit like juggling with knives. Except, as I say, it's not real danger. There's a danger that every so often I'm just going to look like a dickhead.
I'm sure there'll be somewhere in Edinburgh juggling with knives, literally, as well.
Yeah. I'll just have a little look out the window. I'll be able to see three of them.
But do you think doing a show that's experimental in the way that your shows are is a bit easier in a sense in Edinburgh because people expect that, because you don't only perform in Edinburgh, you perform in other parts of the country as well, where people maybe aren't expecting something that's not just somebody stood up talking while they sit down and shut up in the dark. Yeah,
I really enjoy the different ways that my shows meet different kinds of audiences. I think that to some Edinburgh audiences, I'm probably quite sort of safe and mainstream. Yeah. And to some national touring audiences, I'm way out there, completely sort of terrifyingly avant-garde.
Yeah.
And actually, I'm kind of on the cusp. I'm either the mainstream end of experimental or the experimental end of mainstream. I'm always interested in exploring form and finding new ways to express the ideas that I'm exploring. And I'm also interested, as you've already observed, in exploring content that probably occasionally audiences will think, I don't really fancy that. I've paid for a babysitter. I just want a bit of light entertainment, thank you. Yeah. So I want to create work that does have all of that challenge, both in form and in content, but that can bring its audience with it. I don't believe that there's anything in experiment that's inherently difficult. Or indeed, I don't believe there's anything in difficulty that is inherently off-putting or impossible for someone who doesn't have the whole history of avant-garde theatre inside their head.
Yeah.
What I'm not interested in making is experimental theatre that is a complicated set of references to other works of experimental theatre that can only be decoded if you kind of start reading from early Beckett, work your way through to late forced entertainment and pick up everything in between, including the Europeans. I want work that is challenging and in some ways difficult, but that also equips the audience with all of the tools they need to work through it without having already passed a series of earlier exams.
Yeah. But your audience doesn't require that, but you have a background knowledge of all of that stuff. I know I was quite interested on your website. Your PhD is in Brecht's use of clowning techniques, which I mean that surely feeds into the style of performances that you do, does it?
Absolutely, yeah. Or my interest in that comes from the same place as the interest in making the kind of work that I make. It's a bit chicken and egg in some ways. But yeah, of course, I've got an extensive background in making performance, in performance research. I watch a lot of work. I know what's out there. And and all of that feeds into the work that I make. But the work that I make isn't a test on everyone's study of that earlier work that's influenced what I'm creating. The work that I make is my response to the world, and how I form that response might well be influenced by all of that other stuff that I've seen and read. But it's my job to have incorporated all of that, not the audience's.
Yeah.
I mean, and if the work that I make also delights someone who has extensive background knowledge and research and all the rest of it, then that's brilliant. I want to be liked by people who are interested in experiment and in challenging form as well. I don't think, I guess the fundamental thing that I'm saying is that I absolutely refuse the notion that they're mutually exclusive.
Yeah. Well, you're up in Edinburgh with your whole family, 3/4 of whom are involved in this show. You mentioned your wife, Sarah, who until recently was artistic director of the Dukes. She's directing you. Does that make it easier, the fact that you're involved, your wife is directing, or does it mean that you never get a break from it, you never get to walk away?
Well, it depends which way you look at it. It certainly makes planning rehearsals easier because we don't have a long commute.
Yeah.
And we don't have to worry about who's looking after Arthur, at least while we're working. We're perfectly capable of stopping work. But also the reason that we're doing this and the reason that we're making the work we're making is because we're interested in it. So quite often we'll have put the kids to bed and be sitting up, reading or watching something or whatever. And one of us will say, I was just thinking about this other bit. And we will have a conversation about the show. And sometimes the other one, often me, will say, I'm too tired for this now. And we'll talk about it tomorrow instead. So, we're adults. We can have that conversation or not have that conversation. But I think I don't have... there's this sort of idea that you can't ever switch off. And that's mostly a good thing, I think. A lot of my work, or a lot of the writing in particular, is not done while I'm sitting in front of a screen. It's done while I'm walking to the shops, or while I'm out for a run, or while I'm playing something with the kids. The ideas are turning over in the back of my mind. The idea that might therefore be happening, and there's someone there who I can have that conversation with there and then. Well, that's brilliant.
Yeah. So after Edinburgh, what happens with this show and anything else you've got planned?
Well, this show will have some future life after the festival, but it won't have an extensive future life, partly because it relies on Arthur being roughly the age he is now. Once he's able to start sort of crawling around and escaping, then the show is going to be just a very different beast, and it kind of needs that baby who's all potential. And as soon as they start talking a lot like our nearly 3-year-old, or even a slightly older baby, it won't really function, I think. But there will be a few odd dates in the autumn. There'll probably be a couple in Manchester. I think we'll do a week in London. There might be some in Leeds and maybe Newcastle, possibly one or two other places. The exact dates for those are yet to be announced. And it'll depend a little bit on how it flies during the course of August as well. But there will be some future life for it in some form, but then you also asked about other future projects. In the spring of next year, I'll be premiering a new touring theatre piece, actually, for theatre spaces, which will be the first time I've made a new piece of work for theatres for nearly 3 years, actually. What with one thing and another, all of my projects have been taking place like this in people's living rooms, or much more often. I've been doing quite a few really large-scale community and participatory projects that happen outdoors, often site-specific. So I'm really hungry to get back into a theatre space, making a new piece of work. I've directed a couple of things for the stage in that time, but in terms of my work as writer and lead artist, this next thing will be the first, and it's a collaboration with the writer and songwriter Boss Worley, probably best known as a founding member of the band Chumbawamba, with whom he's toured for about 30 years. But we've worked together on a few projects. He's a really dear friend. And one of the things that we've bonded over is a love of running in wild places. We're working on a project called These Hills Are Ours, which is about escaping the city and running to the hills, and about ownership of rural spaces, land ownership more generally, and a whole set of things about the contemporary relationship, particularly as urban people, with rural space and wildness, and why there seems to be a bit more of a hunger for that at the moment. It's about a lot of those things, and that'll be entering the world in the late spring, early summer of the next year.
That was Daniel Bye, whose solo and a half show, as it is billed, Arthur, will be at the Fringe until the 25th of August 2019, and, despite the unconventional performance venue, can still be booked through the Fringe box office. For more information about Daniel Bye, see www.danielbye.co.uk. For more details about the Edinburgh Fringe and to book tickets, see www.edfringe.com. You've been listening to a podcast from British Theatre Guide. For more information, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.